Hello everyone. How mind-blowing is the gap between the poor in China and the US? Americans rely on welfare to get by, while the Chinese strive for a better life through hard work. Why has the highly controversial Big and Beautiful Act torn the two major parties apart? Behind it all lies the shadow of the economic Great Depression from a century ago. Today, we're going to dig deep into these issues, unpack the underlying differences between China and the US, and shed light on the hidden undercurrents in the global financial landscape. Don't go away. Let's start with China. The low-income groups in China mainly consist of low-income farmers in rural areas and migrant workers who move to cities for jobs. Why these two groups? It actually has a lot to do with the historical urban-rural dual structure of our country and the unbalanced regional economic development. In rural areas, farmers basically depend on the land for their livelihood. They work from dawn to dusk, with their income mainly coming from agricultural activities like crop cultivation and livestock breeding. However, farming is extremely vulnerable to the whims of nature. When natural disasters strike or market conditions take a turn for the worse, farmers' incomes take a hit. What's more, the overall income level in agriculture is low and unstable. This is especially true in remote mountainous regions and underdeveloped rural areas, where agricultural technology is relatively backward and large-scale farming is not feasible. Relying solely on the harvest from a few mu of land, it's difficult for rural families to sustain a high-quality life. That's why many rural households send family members to work in cities to supplement their household income. Now, let's talk about migrant workers. They are an important driving force behind China's industrialization and urbanization drive, leaving their hometowns for cities. They take on the most basic and grueling jobs in factories, on construction sites, and in the service sector. Most of these jobs are labor-intensive, with low technical requirements, long working hours, and heavy workloads, but the pay is relatively meager. Living in cities, they also face numerous challenges: shabby accommodation, difficulties in getting their children into school, and inadequate medical insurance coverage. But one thing is particularly worth mentioning: whether they are farmers or migrant workers, China's low-income groups are extremely hardworking, with a strong willingness to strive for a better life and a deep sense of family responsibility. They all dream of improving their lives through their own labor. Farmers seek to upgrade their farming techniques, expand their planting scale, or engage in side businesses like characteristic breeding and agricultural product processing to boost their earnings. Migrant workers, on the other hand, live frugally and send most of their income back home to support the elderly and raise their children, hoping that the next generation can receive a better education and have a brighter future. They all know deep down that only through hard work can they lift their families out of poverty. This aspiration for a better life and the spirit of relentless striving are the most distinctive traits of China's low-income groups. Now that we've talked about China, let's turn our attention to the US. The poor in the US are distinctly different from the low-income groups we know in China, with the most prominent difference being the stronger support that the US welfare system provides to its low-income population. The US welfare system was established during the Great Depression of the 1930s and has evolved into a relatively comprehensive framework over the decades, covering medical assistance, food relief, housing subsidies, childbirth grants, and more. It offers a full range of basic protections to low-income groups. However, it's important to clarify that while some low-income individuals do rely on welfare, it's a gross oversimplification to claim that all of them are poor because they are lazy. According to the latest 2025 data released by the US Census Bureau and the Department of Health and Human Services, the U.S. poverty rate stood at 11.5% in 2024 among the poor population. Those who are long-term welfare dependents, meaning they have received food stamps or medical assistance for more than 24 consecutive months, account for only 23%. This is far from the misconception that a large number of people live off welfare. Furthermore, the rate of substance abuse among the poor is around 18%. The causes of poverty are complex, including unemployment, low wages, poor health, and unbalanced regional economic development, not primarily because people are lazy. There's also a claim that poor Americans deliberately stay poor to get more welfare by having more children, but this lacks substantial evidence to back it up. Although the U.S. welfare system does take family size into account, its core purpose is to ensure basic living standards. The vast majority of low-income families still rely on work as their main source of income. Of course, some people in the poverty-stricken groups do engage in illegal activities. But this is related to many factors such as social governance and lack of employment opportunities, and cannot be simply attributed to welfare dependency. When it comes to the U.S. welfare system, we can't ignore the political game between the two major parties. The Democratic Party's stance on welfare policies is closely tied to its voter base. The U.S. operates under a two-party system, where the core goal of each party is to win elections and seize governing power, and votes are the key to achieving that. The Democratic Party's main supporters include low-income groups, ethnic minorities, and urban elites. Therefore, when it comes to welfare policies, the Democrats tend to expand the scope of protection. Let's take California as a representative example. Since 2019, the California government has allocated approximately $152 million each year for public health services related to substance abuse, such as needle exchange programs and drug rehabilitation treatment. The original intention was to reduce the public health risks associated with drug use, such as the spread of AIDS, not to condone drug use as some people claim. According to the 2024 budget report from the California Department of Finance, the annual investment in this field has reached $320 million, which is in cliffhanger homelessservifilled shutdown. The funds are mainly used for substance abuse treatment, rehabilitation, and temporary housing. It's completely untrue, as rumored online, that over $2 billion is spent building housing for drug users and fully covering their living expenses, let alone that personnel are assigned to accompany drug users throughout their drug use. There was a previous claim that compared this sum of money with the housing security expenditure of Guizhou province in China and the budget of the Health Commission of the Tibet Autonomous Region. This comparison is actually incorrect. In 2024, Guizhou province's housing security expenditure was approximately 89 billion yuan, equivalent to 12.5 billion, while the annual budget of the Health Commission of the Tibet Autonomous Region was about 15.6 billion yuan, equivalent to 2.18 billion, both significantly higher than California's actual investment. Therefore, we won't dwell on this inappropriate comparison. Some people might think that the Democratic-led government only cares about expanding welfare spending and ignores long-term development, but this view is also one-sided. The Democrats do tend to expand welfare protection because they believe this can alleviate poverty and stabilize society, which aligns with their political philosophy and the demands of their voters. The Republicans, on the other hand, prefer to rely on market mechanisms and reduce government intervention to address poverty. The divide between the two parties stems mainly from their different governance philosophies. According to data from the U.S. Census Bureau, the number of poor people in the U.S. has fluctuated over the past few decades rather than growing exponentially. Moreover, about 45% of the children of welfare-dependent families manage to escape poverty through education and employment. Not most of them remain dependent on welfare. Additionally, it's true that the U.S. middle class bears a relatively heavy tax burden, and welfare spending is mainly funded by tax revenue. However, labeling welfare recipients as parasites who live off others' hard work or reverse exploiters of taxpayers is an extreme and unfair characterization. The core function of the welfare system is to ensure basic livelihoods and narrow the wealth gap. Any loopholes in its operation should be addressed by improving the system, rather than dismissing it as a distorted structure. The claim that the liberal elite have created a politically correct fantasy is subjective and biased. We should analyze issues objectively and not get bogged down by such emotional rhetoric. Next, we'll focus on the highly controversial Big and Beautiful Act. The core of this bill is to link welfare benefits to work, optimize welfare distribution, and incentivize people to seek employment. Regarding medical assistance, the bill has a clear work requirement. Starting from January 2027, able-bodied adults aged 18 to 55 without dependent children must work at least 80 hours per month or participate in vocational training to be eligible for medical assistance for non-life-threatening illnesses. It's not the case that all able-bodied adults are subject to this requirement. The core logic behind this regulation is to encourage people to participate in the labor force while providing vocational training support to those in need. It's not simply a case of no work, no welfare. In addition to medical assistance, the bill has also optimized the eligibility criteria for food assistance by adding employment guidance services to help eligible individuals find jobs and enter the labor market. At the same time, the bill has introduced a series of tax incentives for low and middle-income workers. For example, tip income for service industry employees and overtime pay for ordinary office workers are eligible for personal income tax deductions and credits. The aim is to increase the actual income of low and middle-income groups. The previous term used to describe these workers, cattle and horses, is overly emotional. Objectively, we should refer to them as low and middle-income workers. As soon as the Big and Beautiful Act was proposed, it sparked a fierce debate between the two parties. The Democrats criticized the bill for potentially undermining the basic protection of some vulnerable groups, not as robbing the poor to enrich the rich, as some reports have claimed. According to the latest 2025 assessment by the Congressional Budget Office (CBO), the work requirements under this bill could affect the medical assistance eligibility of approximately 3.2 million people, not stripping 12 million people of their benefits. Previous claims that the government subsidizes tens of millions of idle people who stay at home and refuse to work, or funds hooligans who smoke marijuana and engage in $0 shopping sprees are one-sided and unfounded, as they equate a small number of illegal individuals with all welfare recipients. The claim that a large number of undocumented immigrants receive welfare benefits is also inaccurate. According to a 2025 report from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, undocumented immigrants are not eligible for most federal welfare programs. Only about 1.2% of undocumented immigrants have received small amounts of emergency medical assistance through local loopholes. Not a large number of undocumented immigrants mixed in with welfare recipients. Some people have previously applied the U.S. welfare issues to the Chinese context using discriminatory language. We've removed these inappropriate expressions and will view the issues objectively. Nevertheless, the bill has gained support from blue-collar workers in the Rust Belt and some members of the middle class, while facing opposition from low-income groups and public welfare organizations. The core of the controversy lies in how to balance welfare protection and work incentives, not something that can be simply summed up as reversing an unfair situation. The political game between the two parties over the Big and Beautiful Act has even spilled over into the budget appropriation for the new fiscal year. After the Big and Beautiful Act was passed and enacted by Congress, the Democrats expressed their opposition through budget negotiations. This is actually a normal political maneuver under the U.S. two-party system and cannot be described as a sabotage attempt. You may not know that the U.S. federal government's fiscal year runs from October 1st to September 30th of the following year. Congress must pass the budget appropriation bill for the new fiscal year before the current one ends. Otherwise, the federal government will be forced to shut down. September 30th, 2025, was a key deadline for budget negotiations that year. If an agreement had not been reached, approximately 800,000 federal employees would have faced temporary unpaid leave until a new budget bill was passed. At that time, the Democrats proposed budget negotiation conditions to adjust the provisions in the bill that may affect the protection of vulnerable groups, not to repeal the provisions that cut medical insurance and tax credits for low-income people, as previously exaggerated. The game between the two parties over the budget is actually a normal political process, with the core being to balance welfare protection and fiscal sustainability. There is no need to overstate it with extreme descriptions like a dual game of political power and fiscal power. We should view these differences objectively. Faced with the impasse in budget negotiations, the Trump administration adopted a tough stance, insisting on advancing the core provisions of the Big and Beautiful Act. Some previous reports claimed that Trump said, "Let the government shoot down who's afraid. We have the upper hand." However, this statement has no official authoritative source. The accurate description is that Trump publicly stated that he would uphold the core content of the bill and did not rule out the possibility of a government shutdown. There was also a claim that the Trump administration fired a large number of government bureaucrats with Democratic leanings while Congress was shut down, which is also inaccurate. The Trump administration did propose measures to streamline government agencies and optimize fiscal spending. According to 2025 data from the U.S. Office of Personnel Management, between October and December 2025, approximately 12,000 federal employees voluntarily resigned through an early buyout program. These employees came from departments with various partisan leanings. And this was a normal administrative streamlining measure, not 150,000 employees in Democratic-controlled departments being laid off. Nor was there any freezing of large-scale funding projects for state governments led by the Democrats. In the end, the Democrats and Republicans reached partial consensus through negotiations, avoiding a prolonged government shutdown. The previous claim that the Democrats were caught in a dilemma and put in a very passive position is subjective in reality. It was a result of mutual compromise after political game between the two parties. Now that we've discussed the political game between the two parties, let's take a look at the impact of the Big and Beautiful Act on U.S. finances. The implementation of this bill has indeed brought certain pressure to U.S. public finances, with the core issue being balancing tax cuts and fiscal sustainability. According to the 2025 assessment by the Congressional Budget Office, the implementation of this bill will reduce federal fiscal revenue by $1.8 trillion to $2 trillion over the next decade. Note the previously claimed $5 trillion to $6 trillion. This data discrepancy is significant, and we should rely on the assessments of authoritative institutions. You may not know that the core source of revenue for the U.S. federal government is personal income tax, which accounts for approximately 50% of total federal revenue. If we include other taxes related to personal income tax, the proportion exceeds 70%. Therefore, large-scale personal income tax cuts will inevitably lead to a reduction in fiscal revenue, but it's not absolutely unsustainable. The government can offset this loss through measures such as optimizing spending and promoting economic growth. Previous claims that compared the reduced fiscal revenue to the debt of 16 Evergrande groups or the cost of 440 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers are not meaningful and have little relevance to our topic. We'll focus on the fiscal impact itself. In fact, the U.S. is already facing certain fiscal deficit and debt pressures. According to December 2025 data from the U.S. Department of the Treasury, the U.S. national debt has exceeded $35 trillion, with a per capita national debt of approximately $105,000. The fiscal deficit rate in 2025 was 5.8%. Note the previously claimed 6.4%. The Congressional Budget Office predicts that after the implementation of the Big and Beautiful Act, the fiscal deficit rate may rise to 6.5% over the next 5 years, peaking in 2028 before gradually. Investors will demand higher risk premiums, which in turn will drive up borrowing costs across the entire society, thereby suppressing corporate investment and affecting the stability of the job market. Global investors' confidence in U.S. Treasury bonds is directly linked to the debt scale and deficit level. If debt continues to expand, some investors may adjust their holdings, affecting the prices and yields of Treasury bonds. Higher Treasury bond yields will increase corporate financing costs and also impact the stability of the stock market. This is consistent with economic principles. In addition, the expansion of government debt may also produce a crowding out effect, which will have a certain impact on interest-sensitive industries such as real estate and infrastructure construction, inhibiting investment and development in these sectors. However, this process is gradual and will not inevitably form a chain of vicious cycles that suppress economic growth. We should view it objectively. It will indeed have a certain hindering effect on the long-term development of the U.S. economy. At this point, we can cast our gaze back to history. The current U.S. economic and political situation bears some similarities to the Roaring Twenties a century ago, but there are also fundamental differences. After the end of World War I, the U.S. government did promote loose monetary policies. From 1921 to 1927, for as long as 7 years, market interest rates in the U.S. remained at a very low level, even when signs of moderate inflation emerged during this period. The US government still prioritized political goals and did not raise interest rates to curb inflation. At the same time, Andrew Mellon, the US Secretary of the Treasury at that time, led and promoted a substantial tax cut plan, which was passed by Congress. In terms of policy logic, this series of policies bears some similarities to the Big and Beautiful Act introduced by the Trump administration today. However, their historical backgrounds and economic foundations are different, and they cannot be simply equated. The combination of tax cuts and interest rate cuts ushered in a period of prosperity for the U.S. economy, known as the Roaring Twenties. During this time, the Dow Jones Industrial Average rose by approximately 85% from 1924 to 1927, not the previously claimed 100%. There was a certain degree of leverage speculation in the stock and real estate markets, and almost every American wanted to enter the market with leveraged funds to chase the myth of wealth. The prosperity of the capital market also directly drove the rapid development of the consumer goods industry. Americans spent generously during this period, and the concept of installment payments for consumption was widely popularized for the first time. Many Americans who could not originally afford high-priced goods were able to enjoy durable consumer goods such as cars, refrigerators, and washing machines in advance, further stimulating the consumer market. For example, Ford Motor Company launched an installment payment model at that time to attract consumers to buy cars. In 1920, celebrity endorsements for consumer goods first appeared in the U.S., marking the first attempt in history to use the influence of idols to drive commercial sales. In this atmosphere of prosperity, indicators such as U.S. automobile production, residential electricity consumption, and corporate advertising spending grew rapidly. U.S. automobile ownership surged from 8 million in 1920 to 26 million in 1929. This data is accurate. The previous claim that China did not catch up to this number until 1995 is incorrect. China's automobile ownership did not exceed 100 million until 2012, with only about 10 million in 1995, a far cry from the US's 26 million at that time. Americans during the Roaring Twenties had high expectations for sustained economic prosperity, but it's an overstatement to claim that they believed the economic cycle was dead forever. But as the old saying goes, what is done in passion must end in passion. Starting from 1928, signs of partial overheating began to appear in the U.S. stock market. A number of stockbrokers and traders suffered margin calls and went bankrupt due to investment failures. The real estate bubble also inflated to a historical high, leaving the entire market teetering on the brink. Eventually, to prevent the bubble from worsening further, the Federal Reserve had to take back the power to raise interest rates from the White House and implement a tight monetary policy. This move became the straw that broke the camel's back, directly pricking the US's false economic bubble. On October 24, 1929, the New York Stock Exchange experienced Black Thursday. Stock prices plummeted, a large number of stocks were sold off, and the market fell into panic. The US bid farewell to the prosperity of the Roaring Twenties and plunged into the abyss of the 1929 Great Depression. How dire was the situation in the U.S. during the Great Depression? The unemployment rate soared to over 25%, a large number of businesses closed down, banks failed, and countless families lost all their savings. The streets of New York were lined with bankrupts and unemployed people waiting for free soup. The former prosperity vanished without a trace. 2 years prior, cigarette factories in the U.S. had advertised in Times Square, claiming that women smoking cigarettes symbolizes gender emancipation. By the Great Depression, however, many desperate women had to take low-income service jobs to support their families. The previous claim that they were sent by their husbands to work as servants or even prostitutes is too specific and lacks extensive data support. We'll objectively state that they took low-income service jobs. As the real estate bubble burst, a large number of Americans lost their homes. They had to build shabby temporary shacks along the city's riverbanks, parks, and walls using discarded wood, iron sheets, and cardboard boxes. Dissatisfied with President Herbert Hoover's response to the Great Depression, people named these shantytowns Hoovervilles. These slums stretched from Central Park to Fifth Avenue in New York and quickly spread across the U.S., appearing in major cities such as Seattle, Chicago, and San Francisco, the Hoover administration was not completely inactive. During his tenure, it implemented a work relief program, with the famous Hoover Dam being a product of that era. However, these measures were like a drop in the bucket for reversing the downward trend of the Great Depression and failed to address the root causes of the problem. This economic crisis, which originated in the US, quickly spread to Europe and even the entire world, becoming one of the important underlying causes of World War II. Roosevelt implemented the New Deal, expanding government spending, launching public works projects, and establishing a social security system that the U.S. economy gradually stabilized. Coupled with the massive demand for military manufacturing brought about by World War II, the U.S. economy slowly emerged from the quagmire. It's important to correct a false claim. Some people previously referred to Roosevelt as a president who ruled with a trinity of party, government, and military and was called the Emperor of the United States. This is a malicious smear of a historical figure and is completely inconsistent with the facts. The New Deal is widely recognized in history as an effective measure to address the economic crisis. We should view history objectively. It was also from this painful historical lesson that all political forces in the U.S. reached an implicit understanding. The independence of the Federal Reserve must never be easily shaken. Otherwise, the consequences would be more than just simple economic problems. It could trigger profound crises that shake the entire world. But now, a series of measures taken by the Trump administration are breaking this long-standing implicit understanding. What we are witnessing is not just a simple political impasse over the government budget bill. The risk of a government shutdown that the Trump administration is actively courting may seem like a tactical gamble, but in essence, it is an attempt to use presidential executive power to undermine the principle of central bank independence that has maintained U.S. economic stability. When short-term electoral political calculations override long-established fiscal discipline and economic laws, the bursting of the long-accumulated bubbles in the global financial market may not be far away. Currently, to alleviate the fiscal pressure brought about by the Big and Beautiful Act, the Trump administration may be inclined to implement relatively loose monetary policies, because only through a low interest rate policy can the federal government alleviate the enormous pressure of debt interest payments at the source. The U.S. fiscal system is already struggling to function normally in a high interest rate environment, especially given that radical tax cut policies like the Big and Beautiful Act have led to additional huge fiscal deficits. The scale of U.S. government debt has become so large that it has become an important factor influencing the trajectory of the macroeconomy. In this context, U.S. interest rate policy is no longer just a traditional two-dimensional framework aimed at stabilizing inflation and employment. It has added a core element: whether the current interest rate level can maintain the federal government's normal debt servicing capacity. It's important to understand that the more evaluation indicators there are for a matter, the greater the possibility that related powers will be divided and diluted. It is precisely through this opportunity that the Trump administration has been able to legitimately exert influence over the Federal Reserve's monetary policy-making power and fiscal regulatory power with minimal political resistance. More importantly, the independence of the Federal Reserve does not stem from a specific legal mandate or the support of a strong political force. It comes from a fragile political consensus long maintained by the two U.S. parties. Once this balance is broken, the authority and influence of the Federal Reserve will inevitably decline. When the White House finally gains control over both monetary and fiscal policies, it will certainly not limit itself to maintaining low interest rates. The future combination of U.S. monetary and fiscal policies will most likely shift from its past primary goal of combating inflation to a core goal of achieving debt sustainability. Because the Federal Reserve, as the world's central bank, and the U.S., as the epicenter of the global monetary and fiscal vortex, are finding it increasingly difficult to implement policies that are both effective for most countries in the world and conducive to achieving the U.S.'s own core economic interests. Therefore, the gradual weakening of the Federal Reserve's influence and the continuous adjustment of U.S. financial policies are almost irreversible trends. The U.S. can only settle for second best and prioritize ensuring that its own economy does not collapse. whether the rest of the world can withstand the liquidity shock brought about by the US's massive monetary easing is no longer a primary concern of the US government. How future generations will name and evaluate this special period of the 2020s in the 21st century is still unknown. But each of us living in the present is destined to be a part of this history, personally experiencing and witnessing the evolution and direction of this momentous historical era. Alright, that's all for today's discussion on the differences between the poor in China and the US, the US welfare system, the game between the two parties, and global financial risks. If you found today's content helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you can be the first to know when new videos are released. What are your thoughts on the topics we talked about today? Feel free to leave a comment below and join the discussion. We'll see you in the next video.